This week, when Russia invaded Ukraine in late February, many Russian-speaking Jews in the U.S. started organizing direct humanitarian aid to Ukrainians. I talk with one of those Jews, 23-year-old Alice Chudnovsky, about her fundraising for humanitarian and evacuation efforts in the city of Kharkiv. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. If you like this podcast or Jewfolk generally and the work that we do, support us by buying our merch. We recently updated our store, so when you're really exhausted about everything, pick up a shirt that says, "The Jews are tired, stop tweeting like now." Or for your morning coffee, start your day with a mug that has the Jews Are Tired podcast logo on it. People will get the hint, I think, and we've got tons of other designs you should check out too. The point is, a link to our Teespring store is available in the podcast notes, so go take a look, and there's also a link to donate to Jewfolk in the podcast notes if you want to give directly. We appreciate any support you can give. Okay, here's the background for this conversation with Alice Chudnovsky. It's been 3 weeks since Russia invaded Ukraine and launched a horrific war against the Ukrainian people. If you want to know the basis of the war and why Jews should be invested in Ukraine's survival, there's a link in the podcast notes to a piece I wrote called The Jewish Case for Ukraine that explains all of that. The short story is that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin does not believe Ukraine has a right to exist as an independent country and wants Russia to control it out of an imperialist fever dream to restore Russia's former glory. In following that imperialist dream, Russia is committing war crime after war crime after war crime. Bombing hospitals, bombing obvious civilian areas, pretending to agree to humanitarian corridors for civilians to leave cities surrounded by Russian troops, and then bombing and shooting those civilians as they try to leave. The day before this podcast was published, Russia bombed a theater in Mariupol, one of the cities Russia has surrounded, a theater where hundreds of women and children were sheltering. A theater that had, on both sides, in large letters on the ground so that pilots and airplanes could see, written the word children in Russian to make it clear this was not a military target. That theater no longer exists, and the people sheltering there are dead thanks to Russia and Vladimir Putin. You can find an Associated Press story about the devastating situation in Mariupol in the podcast notes. Only read it if you have a strong stomach. These are horrible things happening, and reading about them and seeing photos and videos is really difficult. Take it from someone doom-scrolling Twitter all the time and seeing and reading about this constantly. And in the middle of all of this, in Ukraine, is a humanitarian crisis. People needing food and medicine, Ukrainians leaving their country as refugees, and many Ukrainians staying in the country that they love, either on purpose to fight or to stay with family, or because they are too old or sick to try and start life all over again as refugees. And helping many of them is an impromptu, largely unofficial network of Russian speakers worldwide with connections to Ukraine, many of whom are Russian-speaking Jews. They are in WhatsApp, Facebook, and Telegram groups, coordinating to help people, building aid networks through Instagram, and fundraising directly to help Ukrainians. Alice Chudnovsky is part of this movement, a strategy consultant who has been extensively involved with Jewish organizations like Hillel and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Over the course of many programs and while traveling, and now while helping Ukrainians, she has built up a pretty big network of friends in Ukraine. Chudnovsky is involved with a lot of different aid efforts, but on this podcast I wanted to interview her about a fundraiser she did called Lifeline for Kharkiv. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city, populated before the war by nearly 1.5 million people, and it's also the city my mom is from. Full disclosure, I donated to the Lifeline for Kharkiv fundraiser, which raised $25,000 in just a few days for a group of Ukrainians in Kharkiv who are bringing humanitarian aid and evacuating people from the city. That group has evacuated around 700 people and 80 pets already and imported almost 100,000 pounds worth of humanitarian aid in the form of food, medical supplies, clothing, and defense equipment. Now, Chudnovsky is aiming to fundraise $100,000 and is working to turn this fundraising effort into a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which may end up with a different name than Lifeline for Kharkiv. If you want to help, the link to the fundraiser is in the podcast notes. Any amount of money you can give is appreciated, really. There's also a link to a Facebook post from Chudnovsky about the fundraiser. So, on this episode, I asked her to talk about how she got involved in this effort for Kharkiv, what she's hearing from Ukrainians, what's unique about direct aid efforts compared to just donating to large and well-known humanitarian organizations, and what Jews should be thinking about as we watch this war and humanitarian crisis unfold. Just for some context, toward the end of our conversation, Chudnovsky talks a little about Russian oligarchs and the reality that several of them, including some of the most prominent and influential, are Jewish. Russian oligarchs are millionaires and billionaires who, by virtue of Vladimir Putin's dictatorship in Russia, are largely aligned with Putin after making their money in Russian businesses. They are being sanctioned by the US right now because of that alignment. The Jewish oligarchs have made a name for themselves as philanthropists to Jewish and Israeli causes, most notably Roman Abramovich. He has given tons of money to Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Museum, to the point that Yad Vashem and the Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi of Israel and many other Israeli organizations actually asked the United States not to sanction him. You can find a good JTA story on Jewish oligarch philanthropy in the podcast notes, as well as a Times of Israel write-up about Yad Vashem and the sanctions. Okay, let's get to the conversation with Chudnovsky. As a warning, we're talking about war and the destruction of people's lives. You will hear some things that will disturb you. But if you keep listening, I hope you find it meaningful and educational, and most of all, empowering. There are lots of ways to help Ukrainians, so if you can, please donate to this or another aid organization or fundraiser you trust. So, to jump right in, I know you've been involved in about a bajillion different initiatives to help Ukrainians, but let's focus on your fundraising efforts for a group called Lifeline for Kharkiv. What's the story behind Lifeline for Kharkiv, and how did you get involved in it?
At the start of the war, everyone was just kind of frantically trying to connect people on social media. So someone would post, my grandmother needs this sort of medicine or some water on Instagram. And then on a different story from a different person, I would see someone saying, hey, this is my phone number. I'm willing to bring someone medicine. Just call. And so I started out because, we all felt completely helpless and not really sure what to do. And so I started by just connecting people that I thought could help each other. And through those efforts, I got in touch with a guy named Nikita Shukin, who is from Kharkiv, and he's a friend of a friend. He was responsible for flagging a feature on Google Maps where the Russian military was using the pin feature to mark military targets. And the idea was to kind of scale it as far up into Google admin as we could to make sure that that feature was disabled. I come from a tech background, and so most of my buddies from college went into big tech companies. So I was like, hey, that's actually something that I can help with. Let me call up my buddy Kyle from Google and see if there's anything that he can do. So we ended up escalating this up the chain. The next morning there's an article in the BuzzFeed News saying, Google Maps disables this feature that the Russian military was using. So I don't want to take credit for the actual result because I think there were a lot of people helping flag this issue. The fact of the matter is that there was an impact, and I was like, wow, I can actually do something with my two thumbs and a phone. And so from then on, I started kind of being in touch with people, understanding what's going on, what initiatives there are, asking what possible ways there are to get out of the city. And I noticed on this guy, Nikita's Instagram story, that they are looking for fundraising efforts for a large-scale evacuation from Kharkiv. Why specifically Kharkiv? Because it's my mom's hometown, and I have quite a bit of family, friends, and loved ones there. And I've always felt an emotional connection to the city. And so when I saw that there was an opportunity to get so many people out while the other big nonprofits were still like ramping up in their operations, I was like, let's do this. Like, just tell me how much money you need and I will figure out how to fundraise it. And so they were like, we need $21,000 so that we can rent some more buses. And we are shooting to get 1,500 people out next week. We have some amount of money right now, and we have some buses that were donated to us. But if we want to continue doing this, we're going to need a lot more. And so I was like, okay, $21,000, that easy peasy, right? And so I was just kind of faking it till I was making it, because I genuinely, with fundraising, it's usually hit or miss. You either your concept really catches on to people and the fundraising is incredibly successful, or it's a total flop. And so you kind of never really know which path it's going to take. Like, it's a completely new sphere. People are donating not in the way that they typically donate with this particular issue. And so imagine my surprise when I start this fundraiser on Spot Fund and we fundraise $25,000 in like 3 days. I have never fundraised that much money. And I understand that in the scope of things, it seems like a pretty small number, because we're talking about millions and billions of dollars of aid that are being funneled to Ukraine. But the main appeal for me was that I knew exactly where the money was going. I knew that I could transfer it with very limited loss of money, which means that almost every cent was actually getting to the end user. And I wanted to kind of share this opportunity with other people who seemed not sure what to do with their $15 that they could spare to donate, because, you know, those $15 are probably going to get almost entirely lost in administrative overhead. And so I was like, if anyone wants to donate, this is a good opportunity. Like, I can vouch that this operation is happening.
Can you also say a little, obviously with sort of concern of safety and identities and everything, but could you maybe tell a story or two about what you've heard from people on the ground in terms of what the situation is like for Ukrainians right now?
Actually, let me read you a quote. So in the first couple of days of the war, my friend Nina and I decided so she immigrated to Chicago like 5 or 6 years ago from Kharkiv. And so she still has quite a few local friends still there on the ground. And so during the first few days of the war, they were obviously still there. No one had a chance to evacuate. And so we were like, your stories need to be heard. So we started a Google form to collect their input. I can pull it up and read it to you, because it was just so powerful. And many of these stories, you genuinely can't tell that it's not from 1939. And this guy wrote this in English, so this is not in translation. These are genuinely his original words. My life is nothing like before. I'm not certain of anything, and I don't feel safe anymore at all. All I do is lie on the floor of my bathroom, wrapped in blankets, and hope that artillery won't hit our building. I've learned to tell the difference from outgoing and incoming artillery fire sometimes. Learned to tell the difference between different types of artillery. I wish I never had to learn this in the first place. So that was one quote. And the second quote, I realized that I need 2 bags to pack my whole life. The most important thing is the people around you, their safety and health, not things. The hardest part is understanding what I don't know when I see my family. I consider and scroll in my head only positive scenarios, only our victory. But I understand that while the infrastructure is being built, roads and cities are being exchanged, the route will be safe to travel. Without fragments, glass, months may pass. Really chilling things written by people our age, they're 20-somethings. So these were like concrete quotes that I collected. I have so many more stories. In particular, the most hard-hit region of Kharkiv is Saltovka, which coincidentally is where my mom is from. And so before I get into it, I want to share a personal story that's kind of bitter, because I was in Ukraine from September to November of 2021. And I was visiting Kharkiv. And Saltovka, let's just say, isn't the most pleasant of neighborhoods to visit. It's this kind of old Soviet-style building neighborhood. It's not very industrialized. There's almost nothing near there. And that's not really where tourists or people who come to visit the city hang out. There's genuinely nothing to see there. But before the war, it wasn't the safest neighborhood to wander around in by yourself. And so I thought about going there to visit my mom's old school and my mom's side of the family's like old apartment. And then I was like, do I really want to take the train for like 35 minutes in one direction to visit, excuse my language, a shithole? You know, I'm doing my part, like I'm visiting the nice parts of Kharkiv. We're just going to call it a day. And so I really regret that decision because Saltivka has been bombed to bits in the course of the past 14 days. And I just took it for granted that it would just always be there. And I really shouldn't have. And so that's my connection to Saltivka. So the stories that I'm hearing are primarily for people who are stuck in that neighborhood of Kharkiv. Everywhere else, people are kind of losing power. They're losing gas. Like, it's not great. But for the most part, right now, they're getting some amounts of humanitarian aid in. Like, they are visiting each other. So it's not that terrible. Saltivka, there are no good bomb shelters because, again, it's a very old neighborhood. And because it's being shelled so heavily, people have not been able to get out for 2 weeks. So they are literally just crouching in the corridors in their apartment buildings, hoping that a rocket is not going to strike their building. One of my close friends actually managed to escape with his entire family, and a rocket struck his dvor, the backyard, literally minutes after their car pulled away, and multiple people died. And he was like, that is an image that I will never be able to get out of my mind.
Do you have any, not that it's a lighter note necessarily, but in terms of specifically for the lifeline for Kharkiv, any stories or anything you can tell about the experience of, evacuation or bringing humanitarian aid, what you're sort of hearing and what that's been like?
So keep in mind, my role in the project is very high level. I have not dealt with the intricacies of getting to know people. They really, truly did a great job of setting up a large-scale evacuation mission because they have set up an entire call center. So the people that are organizing the logistics are also not really in touch with the end users of the humanitarian aid and the evacuation. And the team members that are in constant contact with the people that need help are the volunteers from the call center because they're the ones that are receiving the calls. They're the ones that are calling everyone who submits the Google form that says that they need help. And they're the ones that are ultimately responsible for letting them know which bus they're on, where they need to go, and so on and so forth. And so from what I've heard, because we've asked people to send us some responses, the only details I have for you is just people saying thank you. Because for context, the only two other ways to get out of the city is you find someone with a car or you have a car yourself, but pretty much anyone who had that ability already left the city, or you take the train. And I'm sure that you've all seen the images at the train station in Kharkiv with literally thousands of people piled up. And the trains also don't take men and they do not take pets, which for many people that I'm talking to is a huge deal breaker, which is why this particular initiative said, we're not going to break families apart. If men want to come with, we're taking them, you can take a pet with you. And so that has been a huge help because families that had refused to evacuate up until now are now open-minded and are willing to leave.
So, you mentioned this a little bit before about the advantages of sort of giving direct aid. Can you say a little bit about, when channeling your connection to Ukraine and Ukrainians and figuring how to help, you focused on direct aid rather than focus on trying to partner with a larger organization or just sort of pumping your entire network to donate to many of the large humanitarian nonprofits, which have also been fundraising for Ukraine. Can you say a little bit about sort of why turn away from the large organizations and focus on the direct aid in that sense?
So I want to be very clear. I'm not encouraging anyone to explicitly turn away from the larger organizations. I think that now that there has been some amount of time for them to ramp up speed, I am seeing a huge presence on the ground. I've been closely following Hillel Odessa on Instagram, and they're doing a fantastic job of providing humanitarian aid to everyone who needs it in the city, evacuation, etc. So there was some amount of lead time until they were ready to go, but it seems like they're quite powerful in accomplishing what they need to do. For me personally, why I decided to choose this route for involvement instead of advocating for donations to larger organizations is because I think that there already are a lot of people who don't have those personal connections to Ukraine and want to help. And so their only option is to just go through the large organizations because that's all they're familiar with. My goal is to cover people who have those personal connections and have the ability to cause direct aid. So basically, everyone who's in my network has this opportunity to help directly, right? So everyone who knows me, they trust me that I am the vessel for the donations and that they will go where they need to go. People who don't know me may not have access to an initiative like this, And that's probably majority of Americans. And so their only choice is to donate to the larger organizations. And so I think that it's a piecewise approach, right? So the larger organizations are going to cover large clusters of the population. But here we're trying to fill the small gaps that are left of people who are still not getting help. And there's always going to be those gaps, no matter how efficient those large nonprofits are. And again, so I encourage you, if you have, and I'm talking to the audience here, I'm not saying don't donate to the large organizations, but I'm saying that if you see an initiative that's run by someone that you trust, help them and consider helping them, because that's an opportunity that is not given to other people. And you have a chance to kind of cover those people that are not being served by anyone else at the current moment.
So what also comes next? Because I saw, sort of full disclosure, I'll write this in the intro as well, but I donated to Lifeline for Kharkiv. My mom is from Kharkiv. I'm obviously invested in what happens in Ukraine. But you wrote on Facebook that you have raised $25,000, up that to $100,000. Have already sent the first batch of money over and also plan to file as a 501c3, which is kind of sort of a big leap for what started as just a direct fundraiser through you. Can you sort of say what comes next? What's the larger vision of what's happening? Because it also seems like, unfortunately, we're reaching a point in the war where it's becoming not normal by any means, but we're getting used to the fact that this is a situation that will seemingly be long-term.
Yeah, I totally agree. So the priority here is sustainability. And as much as this idea of grassroots donating is attractive and kind of works on a short-term timescale, ultimately, bigger donors are more willing to donate when the donations are tax deductible. Additionally, when you register as a nonprofit, as an NGO, you become eligible for partnerships with larger nonprofits who need partners on the ground. So from my understanding, the way that the big nonprofits in the US work is that they are not the ones that are physically setting up the logistics on the ground. An American nonprofit is, for the most part, in charge of fundraising, and then they transfer that money to their partners on the ground, who are the locals and know the intimate lay of the land, like how everything works, the bureaucracy where bribes need to be given, etc. And the bribes were obviously a joke because NGOs obviously wouldn't do that in Ukraine. So why register as a 501c3 is because we are definitely certain that we want to keep this on a very personal and transparent level. We're not trying to scale to the same size as most of the other nonprofits. We're just trying to make sure that we are keeping our options open for additional partnerships so that we can sustain our operation for as long as possible. So that's kind of the first bit. Why the goal to $100,000? I agree that's very ambitious. From what I'm seeing, a lot of people so far have resisted evacuating because they're under the impression that this isn't going to last very long. And I think that all of us that aren't in a traumatic mental state and are watching this kind of from the sidelines are starting to realize that maybe that's not the case. And so we are preparing ourselves for the second wave of evacuation when people will start realizing that this is not a sustainable thing. This is not a state that they can live in for months. And additionally, more and more of the aid is going to go towards humanitarian aid. So much needed food, medicine, and supplies for the people who literally can't evacuate from the city. There's a lot of women with tiny children and a lot of elderly who are just not sufficiently mobile to safely make it out of the city, and they need a lot of help. There are families with a lot of pets that also don't want to evacuate. And so there's just a lot of different situations where people ultimately still won't be able to evacuate. And there's going to be a lot of people who are participating in the defense efforts, and those will need to be taken care of as well. And so the goal is to prepare for the second wave of evacuation and slowly transition towards being more of a direct humanitarian aid supply into that particular city. I was also surprised at the initial figure given to me because I was like $25,000 for buses. That seems really expensive. But I want to share that I did request the computation spreadsheet for how much everything costs. And with the rising fuel costs and how much humanitarian aid is being brought in and how much other organizations are charging for renting their buses, that is an accurate estimate. So if you think about it, $20,000 is needed to evacuate 1,500 people. 100,000 is going to be what? 7,000 people? That's a tiny fraction of the city. Like, yes, it's a lot of human lives still saved, but it's not that ambitious of a goal.
The last question I have for you is just to sort of zoom out a moment. Any thoughts as a Russian-speaking Jew, sort of the Jewish angle on watching the war in Ukraine and its impact unfold, or even just, what you think the most important thing is to understand about this war for Jews or any other listeners?
Oh, so many. So I'm going to start from the lens of the RSJ identity. A lot of people immediately feel allegiance to the Jews and want to help just the Jews. And I think that this is the first situation where I'm seeing a lot of Russian-speaking Jews express kinship to just regular Ukrainians as well. And if you're seeing the way that aid is just dispersed through major Jewish nonprofits, you will see that Chabad is not just helping Jews. Hayas is not just helping Jews. JDC is not just helping Jews. So yes, the main point of their efforts is to obviously serve the Jewish community. But I found it surprising that in this particular case, Ukrainians are Jews. And so to me, that was a huge revelation. And I obviously feel that way as well. And that was part of the reason why I initially started participating in grassroots ways, because I felt a lot of pain for all of my non-Jewish friends that were stuck. And I wasn't sure if I could rely on the assistance of Jewish organizations to assist them. So I'm pleasantly surprised that they have the bandwidth to help everyone. And I hope that that continues. But I just want to say that this isn't a Jewish versus non-Jewish situation. It seems like a lot of Ukrainian Jews have put their Ukrainian identity first and their Jewish identity second. And I'm seeing a lot of Ukrainian Jews in the diaspora do the same. So that's the first point. And the second point is I am terrified about what this war means for Jews globally, because we've seen the Jewish topic brought in literally from the first day of the war, when Putin's pretense for entering Ukraine was that he wanted to denazify the country. So on one hand, we have this pretense that has to do with Jews for the invasion. And on the other hand, we have a Jewish president. We have a Jewish figure of power. And that's a little bit concerning. So he has been a great role model, but obviously it's very easy to spin news in this age. And when you have so many high profile Jews come into public attention, people are going to start wondering, why is all of the leadership Jewish? And you might say, well, Putin isn't Jewish, so this clearly isn't a problem. Yes, but read about all of the oligarchs there. We are suddenly finding out that all of them are Jewish. And to me, that is a little bit scary, because I think that it's very easy to start getting into the Elders of Zion conspiracy. And so in particular, the latest scandal was about Roman Abramovich, the Russian-Israeli oligarch, who's been hit personally very hard by sanctions. Jews and Russian-speaking Jews are really going to have to examine their relationship to Eastern Europe, because it is no longer relevant to them. Jews have been brought into this conflict already. And I want to make sure that American Jews and Israelis that don't have close family ties to Eastern Europe remember that they're still part of the conflict, whether they choose to be or not, which means you can't close your eyes. You need to stay informed and you need to participate.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news, stories, or reports referenced for this episode.